Officer Davis stepped out of his patrol car just as Melissa Crawford finished recording me with her phone, standing knee-deep in my empty pool with a power washer in my hands. "Sir, we received reports of property destruction and possible water waste violations," Officer Davis said, consulting his notepad. "Ma'am here says you're damaging community property values by draining your pool." I looked up from scrubbing algae off the pool walls, water dripping from my work gloves, and pulled out the leather wallet I'd carried for 15 years. "Officer, I'm Agent Derek Stone, FBI. This is my pool, on my property, and I'm cleaning it before my daughter's wedding reception next month." The badge glinted in the afternoon sun as Melissa's face went white. Turns out, calling the cops on a federal agent because you don't like pool maintenance wasn't her smartest move. Now, I know some of you have dealt with neighbors who think they own your property decisions, people who call authorities over things that are absolutely none of their business. Maybe you've had someone try to control what you do in your own backyard, or threaten you with consequences for perfectly legal activities. I'd love to hear your craziest neighbor interference story in the comments, because after you see how far Melissa Crawford was willing to go to control my pool maintenance, you'll realize some people really don't know when to mind their own business. But let me explain how we got to this point, because the story of how a simple pool cleaning became a federal case is, well, it's something else. My name is Derek Stone, and 6 months ago, I retired from 15 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. My wife Angela and I moved to Sunset Ridge Estates to be closer to our daughter Emma, who was planning her dream wedding for next month. After spending a decade and a half chasing white-collar criminals across the country, the idea of a quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest drama involved garbage pickup schedules sounded like paradise. The house came with a beautiful pool that had been neglected by the previous owners, green algae coating every surface, cracked tiles around the deep end, a filtration system that had clearly been broken for months. It was going to take serious work to make it wedding reception ready, but Emma had always dreamed of a backyard wedding reception. 60 guests, string lights over the pool, her grandmother's garden roses reflecting in crystal clear water. After 15 years of missing family moments because I was investigating financial fraud cases in different time zones, this was my chance to give her something perfect. The pool renovation became my retirement project, a way to stay busy while adjusting to civilian life after years of federal law enforcement. Every morning at 7 a.m., I'd be out there with tools and cleaning supplies, methodically working through the restoration process. First came draining the 12,000 gallons of swamp water that had been festering since the previous owners moved out. Then pressure washing every inch of concrete to remove years of algae buildup. The work was physical, satisfying, and completely different from the mental chess game of tracking financial criminals. But paradise has a way of attracting trouble, and ours came in the form of Melissa Crawford, Sunset Ridge, HOA president, and self-appointed neighborhood quality control manager. Melissa was the type of person who measured lawn height with a ruler and knew every HOA bylaw by memory. But what I didn't initially understand was why she cared so much about everyone else's property maintenance. Melissa Crawford had been Sunset Ridge HOA president for 6 years, ever since her real estate license got suspended for what she called aggressive sales tactics and the state licensing board called fraud. The suspension had destroyed her primary income source just as she'd leveraged herself into 3 rental properties within the neighborhood. Now, her financial survival depended entirely on maintaining property values that would keep her rental income flowing and her mortgage payments manageable. What made Melissa particularly dangerous was her intelligence. She wasn't just a petty busybody with too much time. She was a financially desperate woman with real estate knowledge, legal connections, and the authority of an HOA presidency. She understood exactly how property values worked, which regulations could be weaponized, and how to make someone's life miserable while staying technically within legal boundaries. Melissa appeared at my fence line exactly 3 days into the pool draining process, wearing her HOA president badge like a federal marshal's star. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried a leather portfolio that looked more expensive than most people's monthly car payments. "Mr. Stone, I need to discuss the impact your project is having on neighborhood aesthetics and property values. An empty pool creates the appearance of abandonment and neglect." I looked up from pressure washing algae stains, noting how she stood just far enough back to avoid getting splashed, like she was afraid of getting dirty from actual work. Mrs. Crawford, this is routine pool maintenance for my daughter's wedding next month. Everything should be completed within 2 weeks. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. The issue isn't timeline. Mr. Stone, it's process. Pool renovations of this scope require HOA pre-approval and adherence to community standards. According to Melissa, my pool renovation was creating multiple community concerns that threatened the financial stability of the entire neighborhood. The drained pool was an eyesore affecting neighboring property values. The pressure washing noise was excessive for residential use during peak hours. Even my disposal of the old pool equipment was somehow creating environmental hazards that could result in municipal fines. Standing there listening to this woman turn my daughter's wedding preparation into a list of violations, I felt my investigative instincts stirring for the first time since retirement. 15 years of examining financial fraud had taught me to recognize when someone's motivations didn't match their stated concerns. Melissa wasn't worried about community standards. She was worried about money. Mrs. Crawford, I appreciate your concern, but I've checked the HOA guidelines and there's nothing about pool maintenance requiring pre-approval. That's when her mask slipped just slightly. The guidelines are being updated to reflect current property value protection standards. The HOA board has determined that pool maintenance of this scope requires detailed timeline documentation and impact assessment. 5 days later, I received a formal notice that felt like a legal summons. Emergency HOA. Hearing regarding property value impacts at 23 Riverside Court. The return address was printed on letterhead that looked suspiciously official for a neighborhood association. The community center felt like a courtroom when I walked in that Tuesday evening. Melissa had arranged the chairs in a semicircle with herself at the center. A projector showing before and after photos of my pool like evidence in a criminal trial. 8 board members sat with matching folders, all clearly briefed beforehand on whatever presentation Melissa had prepared. Ladies and gentlemen, Melissa began, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting her way. We're here tonight to address a situation that threatens the financial stability of our entire community. Her presentation was professional, almost too professional. She'd calculated theoretical property value impacts using comparable sales data, researched municipal codes that might apply to residential renovations, even prepared a PowerPoint with charts and graphs showing potential neighborhood depreciation. Mr. Stone's renovation project has depressed comparable property values by an estimated 2 to 5% within a quarter-mile radius. Based on community association liability standards, the HOA board votes to impose daily fines of $200 until the project reaches completion or the pool is restored to its original state. As I listened to Melissa's financial projections and legal citations, my training kicked in without conscious thought. 15 years of investigating financial fraud had taught me to recognize when someone's numbers didn't add up, when legal authority was being fabricated, when desperate people used official-sounding language to mask criminal behavior. Her property value calculations were based on cherry-picked data from different neighborhoods with different market conditions. Her legal citations referenced commercial codes that didn't apply to residential renovations. Her community association liability standards appeared to be completely invented. This wasn't community concern. This was calculated manipulation using fabricated financial evidence to extort money from a neighbor. But I wasn't ready to reveal my background yet. Instead, I asked simple questions that any reasonable homeowner might ask. Mrs. Crawford, could you provide the specific HOA bylaw that grants authority to impose daily fines for pool maintenance? Her answer was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak about implied authority and community protection standards that meant absolutely nothing. When I requested copies of the comparable sales data she'd cited, she claimed it was proprietary information from her real estate background. That's when I knew I was dealing with someone who thought her official title made her untouchable. Someone who had never encountered a target with the resources and experience to fight back effectively when I didn't immediately pay the bogus fines. Melissa escalated to what she thought was her ultimate weapon: government enforcement agencies. If the HOA couldn't intimidate me into compliance, maybe city and county authorities could. City Environmental Department? This is Melissa Crawford, HOA President of Sunset Ridge Estates. I need to report illegal dumping and water waste violations at 23 Riverside Court. Over the next week, I dealt with visits from a parade of municipal inspectors. each one responding to Melissa's creative interpretations of environmental and building codes. Environmental services came for illegal pool water disposal. Apparently, draining my own pool into the municipal storm system was somehow criminal. Code enforcement arrived for unpermitted renovation work, despite my having no permits required for basic pool cleaning. The water department investigated wastewater violations that existed only in Melissa's imagination. Each inspector was professional, apologetics, and ultimately found 0 violations. Each report was filed as unfounded complaint. But Melissa kept calling, kept escalating, kept trying to find an authority that would shut down my pool renovation and validate her invented HOA powers. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when I was pressure washing pool tiles for what felt like the 100th time, trying to remove algae stains that had been building for years. The work was meditative, methodical, exactly the kind of simple physical task that helped me decompress from decades of complex federal investigations. That's when Officer Davis pulled into my driveway, responding to Melissa's latest call about property destruction happening on my own property. Standing knee-deep in my own empty pool, being questioned about destroying my own property while preparing for my daughter's wedding. I realized Melissa Crawford had crossed a line from neighborhood nuisance to criminal harassment. And that's when I decided it was time to show her exactly what kind of neighbor she'd been messing with. When Officer Davis asked for identification, I pulled out the leather credential wallet I'd carried through hundreds of federal cases, from Wall Street securities fraud to international money laundering investigations. The gold badge caught the afternoon light as I flipped it open, revealing the seal that had opened doors and ended careers across 3 decades of federal law enforcement. I'm Agent Derek Stone, FBI, Financial Crimes Division, retired but with active consultation status. This is my residence, my pool, and my renovation project for my daughter's wedding reception. Officer Davis studied the badge with the careful attention of someone who knew the difference between real federal credentials and the fake badges that wannabe authority figures sometimes flashed. His entire demeanor shifted from routine complaint response to professional respect. Agent Stone, I apologize for the interruption. Ma'am? He turned toward Melissa, who was standing frozen on my property line like someone had hit her with a stun gun. You've filed 6 false reports about this address in the past week. That's a pattern we need to discuss. The color had drained completely from Melissa's face. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak. But no words came out. For someone who had spent weeks using official-sounding language to intimidate me, she was remarkably speechless when confronted with actual federal authority. Officer, there must be some mistake. She finally managed, her voice shaking. I'm the HOA president. I have a responsibility to report violations that affect community standards. Ma'am, what you've been reporting aren't violations. They're false complaints designed to harass a federal agent. Officer Davis's tone was firm but professional. I'm going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow to discuss this pattern of false reporting. As Officer Davis drove away and Melissa retreated to her house with her usual confidence completely shattered, I realized that my peaceful retirement had just taken an interesting turn. What Melissa didn't understand was that my badge didn't just identify me. It gave me access to investigation tools she'd never imagined. Within 2 hours of Officer Davis's visit, I was back in investigation mode for the first time since retirement. My home office, which had been collecting dust since we moved to Sunset Ridge, suddenly became an active command center. Federal database access didn't expire with retirement, especially for agents with active consultation status on ongoing financial crimes cases. The first search revealed information that explained everything about Melissa's behavior. Her real estate license suspension wasn't just for aggressive sales tactics, it was for mortgage fraud. Specifically, she'd been falsifying income documents for buyers who couldn't qualify for conventional loans, collecting fees from both the buyers and the banks, while knowing the transactions were based on fraudulent information. But that was just the beginning. Property records showed that Melissa's 3 rental properties had been purchased with cash from a business account flagged for suspicious financial activity. The account belonged to something called Crawford Property Consulting, which existed only on paper and had never filed business taxes or reported legitimate income. Real estate transaction histories revealed a pattern that made my federal investigator instincts go into overdrive. Melissa had been systematically targeting elderly homeowners in financial distress, offering to help them avoid foreclosure by purchasing their properties at below-market prices, then immediately flipping them for substantial profits. It was a classic predatory lending scheme disguised as community assistance. The smoking gun came when I accessed HOA financial records through my federal database privileges. What I found was a textbook example of the financial fraud I'd spent 15 years prosecuting. Melissa had created a phantom account called Sunset Ridge Community Enforcement Fund, where fine payments were deposited directly into her personal checking account. Over 2 years, she'd collected nearly $40,000 in completely fabricated fines from community members using fraudulent legal documents that looked official but had no legal authority. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, 89 years old and living on Social Security, had paid over $4,000 in emergency landscaping fines to avoid what Melissa claimed would be HOA legal action, resulting in property seizure. The Wilson family had paid $1,500 for architectural violations that existed only in Melissa's imagination. The Chen family had been systematically billed for noise violations every time their children played in their own backyard. Each victim had received official-looking notices on HOA letterhead, complete with legal language about community association, enforcement authority, and municipal code compliance requirements. To elderly residents who didn't understand the difference between legitimate HOA authority and criminal fraud, Melissa's documents looked absolutely authentic, but federal database access revealed that none of these fines had any legal basis. The letterhead was fake. The legal citations were fabricated, and the enforcement authority was completely invented. Melissa Crawford wasn't running an HOA. She was running a sophisticated financial fraud operation using her official title as cover for criminal activity. This was exactly the type of federal crime I'd spent my career investigating. A systematic financial fraud targeting vulnerable populations, using fake authority to extract money through intimidation and false legal claims. The only difference was that instead of targeting strangers, Melissa was victimizing her own neighbors. I made one phone call to my former partner, Agent Sarah Mitchell, who was still active in the Financial Crimes Division and currently working 3 major fraud cases involving fake authority schemes. Sarah, I need a consultation on a potential federal case. Financial fraud involving fake governmental authority and systematic targeting of elderly victims. Derek, you know I can't run federal databases for personal matters. Retirement means retirement. This isn't personal anymore. We're looking at mail fraud, Wehre Fraud, elder abuse, and systematic financial exploitation using fabricated legal documents. I've got at least 15 victims and evidence of interstate banking violations. The tone of her voice changed immediately. Send me everything you have. If this is what it sounds like, we're looking at serious federal charges. Agent Mitchell arrived at my house the next morning with a full forensic accounting team and equipment that looked like something from a high-tech crime drama. For someone who had been quietly renovating a pool just days earlier, watching FBI agents set up a mobile command center in my garage was surreal. Derek, this is bigger than you thought, Sarah said, reviewing the evidence I'd compiled. Melissa Crawford isn't just running local fraud. She's part of a network. We've been tracking similar schemes in 4 different states, all using the same fake legal documents and enforcement language. The forensic analysis revealed connections that local law enforcement would never have discovered. Melissa's Crawford property consulting business was linked to a Delaware corporation that existed only to launder money from fraudulent real estate transactions. The bank account receiving her fake HOA fines was connected to accounts in Nevada and Florida that were flagged for suspicious activity. Most damning of all, the legal documents Melissa had been using to intimidate residents were identical to documents used in fraudulent HOA schemes across the country. She wasn't operating alone. She was part of an organized criminal network that specialized in exploiting homeowner associations for financial gain. We're looking at federal RICO charges, Agent Mitchell explained as her team documented evidence. Organized financial fraud, elder abuse, mail fraud, Wehre Fraud, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. This isn't neighborhood harassment. This is organized crime. While federal agents were building a criminal case that would eventually span multiple states, I decided it was time for the Sunset Ridge community to understand exactly what kind of person had been controlling their HOA for 6 years. I called a special community meeting, but this time I brought federal backup. The community center had never hosted an FBI presentation before, and the sight of Agent Mitchell setting up federal evidence displays drew a crowd that included every resident who had ever paid one of Melissa's bogus fines. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, standing where Melissa had delivered her intimidating presentations just weeks earlier. What you've experienced over the past several years isn't aggressive HOA management. It's systematic financial fraud perpetrated by someone who used your trust and community position to commit federal crimes. Agent Mitchell took over with the kind of detailed presentation that federal prosecutors use in court, charts showing financial flow between fake accounts, documentation of fraudulent legal citations, evidence of organized criminal networks, the full scope of Melissa's operation laid out with FBI precision. Mrs. Crawford faces federal charges including mail fraud, Fraude, elder abuse, criminal conspiracy, and racketeering. Each count carries potential penalties of up to 20 years in federal prison and complete financial restitution to victims. The room erupted as neighbors realized the extent to which they'd been victimized. Mrs. Henley stood up, her hands shaking as she held a folder full of Melissa's fake violation notices. I paid her $4,000 because I was afraid of losing my home. She said the HOA could force a sale if I didn't comply with emergency landscaping requirements. Tom Wilson, a retired electrician who'd been paying Melissa's fabricated fines for 2 years, stood up with obvious anger. She charged us $1,500 for architectural violations that she said were reported by anonymous neighbors. When I asked to see the complaint, she said HOA privacy rules prevented disclosure. The Chen family shared their story of systematic harassment disguised as noise violation enforcement. Every time our children played outside, we'd get citations for disturbing community peace. We paid over $2,000 trying to keep our kids from being too loud in their own backyard. Story after story revealed the same pattern. Melissa identifying vulnerable residents, creating fake violations with official-looking documentation, then collecting money through intimidation and fear of legal consequences that didn't exist. But the most devastating testimony came from elderly residents who had been specifically targeted because of their age and financial vulnerability. Mrs. Patterson, 85 years old, and suffering from early-stage dementia, had paid nearly $3,000 for medication compliance violations and completely invented fines related to her prescription deliveries. Mr. Franklin, a Korean War veteran living on disability payments, had been charged repeatedly for vehicle maintenance violations related to his 20-year-old pickup truck. Melissa had convinced him that the HOA could have his truck impounded if he didn't pay fines for community appearance standards. Each victim story represented hours of federal investigative work. But more importantly, each represented a neighbor who had been systematically victimized by someone they trusted to protect their community interests. Agent Mitchell documented every testimony as evidence for federal prosecution, but she also explained the broader implications of Melissa's criminal network. This type of organized fraud typically involves multiple perpetrators across different jurisdictions. Mrs. Crawford's operation connected to similar schemes in Nevada, Florida, Texas, and Delaware. We're looking at a criminal organization that specifically targets homeowner associations because of their quasi-governmental authority and limited oversight. The federal investigation moved with the efficiency that only federal resources can provide. Within 72 hours, agents had executed search warrants on Melissa's house, her rental properties, and every financial account connected to her fraudulent operations. The evidence collected filled 3 bankers' boxes and included everything needed for comprehensive federal prosecution: fake legal documents, fraudulent financial records, correspondence with co-conspirators in other states, and detailed lists of victims with financial documentation of their losses. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when federal agents arrested Melissa Crawford on federal fraud charges while she was still wearing her HOA president polo shirt. The irony of someone being taken into federal custody while dressed as a community authority figure wasn't lost on anyone who had suffered under her fraudulent regime. The arrest took place on a Tuesday morning as I was installing new pool tiles for Emma's rapidly approaching wedding. Federal agents arrived in unmarked vehicles, presented their warrants with professional courtesy, and conducted the arrest with the same efficiency they brought to organized crime investigations. Watching Melissa being read her federal rights while neighbors gathered to witness her downfall felt like justice in its purest form. After months of using fake authority to intimidate vulnerable people, She was finally confronting real authority with real consequences. Federal prosecution moved swiftly once Agent Mitchell presented the evidence to federal prosecutors. Melissa's attorney advised her to accept a plea agreement rather than face trial on charges that could result in decades in federal prison. The plea hearing was everything her victims needed to see. Melissa Crawford, former HOA president and neighborhood authority figure, standing before a federal judge admitting guilt to multiple felonies while her victims watched from the gallery. Mrs. Crawford, you've pled guilty to mail fraud, Wehre Fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Do you understand that you'll serve 36 months in federal prison and pay complete restitution of $47,000 to your victims? Yes. Your Honor, do you understand that your real estate license is permanently revoked and you're prohibited from holding any position of authority in homeowner associations or community organizations? Yes. Your Honor, the restitution order included not just the money Melissa had stolen through fake fines, but also damages for emotional distress and financial hardship caused by her systematic fraud. Mrs. Henley received $4,500. The Wilson family got $1,800. Every victim received compensation that exceeded what they'd originally paid in fraudulent fines. But perhaps more importantly, the federal prosecution sent a message to other potential HOA fraudsters that victimizing vulnerable homeowners would result in serious federal consequences. 2 weeks later, Emma's wedding reception was everything she'd dreamed of and more. 60 guests celebrating around a crystal-clear pool with string lights reflecting perfect illumination on water that had been restored through weeks of careful work. Mrs. Henley brought her famous lemon cake and told everyone who would listen how grateful she was that Agent Derek had protected the community from that terrible woman. The Wilson family provided live music from their son's band, the Chen children, finally free to play outside without fear of fake noise violations, turned the reception into an impromptu neighborhood celebration. Every neighbor who had been victimized by Melissa's fraudulent fines came together to celebrate not just Emma's marriage, but the restoration of their community from systematic criminal exploitation. As I walked Emma down the makeshift aisle past the pool that had caused so much trouble, I realized something important about the transition from federal law enforcement to civilian life. Real authority isn't about controlling people through fear and fabricated rules. It's about protecting people from those who would abuse them. For 15 years, I'd investigated financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. I'd seen how predators used official-sounding language and fake authority to exploit people's trust and fear. But I'd never imagined that retirement would involve using those same investigative skills to protect my own neighbors from the same type of criminal behavior. The pool lights danced on the water as Emma and her new husband shared their first dance. Surrounded by a community that had learned the difference between legitimate authority and criminal exploitation, Mrs. Henley sat at a table with other elderly residents, no longer afraid that growing flowers or receiving medication deliveries would result in fake legal consequences. Melissa Crawford was serving federal time while her victims were celebrating freedom from systematic fraud. Her rental properties had been sold to compensate the people she'd victimized, and her fake authority had been replaced by genuine community leadership, focused on actual neighborhood improvement rather than personal profit. Sometimes the best part about retirement from federal law enforcement isn't leaving the job behind. It's discovering that the skills you've developed can still protect people who need protection. And sometimes, when a neighborhood bully tries to weaponize fake authority against a federal agent, the best response is showing them what real federal authority looks like when it's used to seek justice. The investigation that started with a drained pool ended with federal convictions, community restoration, and a wedding reception that brought together neighbors who had learned to trust each other again. Melissa Crawford had thought she could intimidate a retired federal agent with fake HOA authority, but instead she'd encountered someone with the resources and experience to expose her entire criminal operation. As the evening wound down and neighbors helped clean up around the pool that had started everything, I realized that some stories end exactly the way they should, with justice served, victims compensated, and communities restored to what they're supposed to be, places where people look out for each other instead of preying on each other. The pool renovation was complete, the wedding was perfect, and federal justice had prevailed over neighborhood fraud. Sometimes retirement turns out better than you'd ever planned.